What I am going to do is rather in a certain telegraphic way present sort of directions of my research, not simply, you know, a consistent talk on the problem, but different ways and different paths in my own research and dealing with the problem of the relations of translation with the with politics. I have chosen the metaphor and the picture of the god Janus. There are several good reasons why this metaphor applies to translation, but I will give you only two good reasons. First, if someone or something is said to be two-faced, it immediately evokes the problem of trust and fidelity. And you know, this is the much discussed opposition between the original and sort of its imitation, that might be counterfeit, that might be deceitful, etc. But this is generally the problem of fidelity in translation, which is a classical topic of theory of translation. Secondly, in Roman mythology, the god Janus, he's depicted with two heads, as you know, simultaneously looking forward and backward. Was a god of all sorts of transitions, beginnings and endings, entrances, exits, and passageways. He would be depicted with keys in one hand and with the staff in another hand, you know, to show you the way to open the doors. He's sort of doorkeeper, janitor, and always represented in the middle ground between barbarism, civilization, rural and urban spaces, etc. But which is what is more interesting for us. Janus was able, as I said, to see into the future and at the same time into the past. But in the times of war, he was able to see not only the beginning, but also the end of a war. This is why I think we are lacking today such a god precisely in the situation in which we live. And this situation might be described as being at war. Yes, I'm already in Ukraine, just to give you some idea about the role of translation in generating the Ukrainian conflict and war. The tensions between Russian and Ukrainian language raises already in 91 when the government of Ukraine introduced long-term programs of translating textual materials for kindergarten, schools, and other institutions, including TV programs. And while one part of the population supported it, another part sees in these translations the measures in these translations an attack on their mother tongue, Russian. This also implied the establishment of certain hierarchy of the languages, of two languages. 89, this was still the Soviet Union. Ukrainian language was declared official, while the Russian language was supposed to be used in the communication with other Soviet republics. Now, but already in 94, there was a referendum in the regions of Donetsk and Lugansk. You know, these are now the front lines. 90% of the citizens requested the official status for Russian language in these regions, besides, of course, Ukrainian. The parliament in Kiev ignored this request. Finally, 96 in the constitution adopted in the parliament, Ukrainian was declared as the sole official language in the country, while Russian, among other languages spoken in Ukraine, got the status of a language of national minority. This is how the linguistic situation changed already at the beginning of the 90s. After Maidan, it got only worse in these terms. The separation of two of two languages. So in January 2017, Ukrainian becomes, as I said, the sole official language in public institutions, which was especially traumatic for the Russian speakers. But and you know how this develops with Yanukovych trying to reverse this situation, and then derussification after Maidan. But I would like to again to emphasize it. At the beginning of the conflict, there was a translation used, so to say, as a tool of bordering between two languages, and later between two now clashing politically and militarily forces. What I want you now is to pay attention to two moments which are most important for my argument. First, this is the question of the character of the linguistic praxis in the country before translation did the final cut of separation between the two languages. We might ask ourselves whether people were translating or not in this situation before the introduction of translation as a tool of separation. And if yes, why, if they were also translating, why the fact of these translations has become invisible, or better, why the translation introduced in 91 has suppressed the translation that had been practiced before. And secondly, and I think this is crucial moment, generally of our understanding of the political role of translation, this is the question of the site at which the whole drama of translation as separation and of translation of linguistic into a political difference takes place. And this is the institutional threshold. This is the traumatic site where translation becomes extremely political, and when I say extremely political, means forges antagonisms. Something interesting, December 2016, in Ukraine, all the information in railway and airports were given, of course, de-Russified, not in Russian, but instead of Russian, in English. So it's not simply, turn from bilingualism, although there was no bilingualism before, it was something else, but turn to another bilingualism. Instead of Russian, now it was English. This introduced my next topic, the topic of the so-called, something I would like to call the neo-vernacular condition. And I would even claim that this is the topic, this is the condition and in which we live today. The idea comes from German philologist Jürgen Trabant, who in the last 10-15 years wrote polemical text against what he calls re-vernacularization of German and other European languages. You know what are vernaculars? Are the languages before, or we might we shall rather say forms of linguistic practice before these forms were elevated into what we call today standardized national languages. So, speaking of the re-vernacularization of German and other European cultural languages, as he called them, Trabant points at the new socio-linguistic and cultural condition that, as he writes, resembles the Europe of the Middle Ages, when Latin dominated all the higher levels of social, political, and intellectual life, with the lower social strata speaking old vernaculars. Nowadays, of course, it is English that has taken the role of the new lingua franca. It is spoken in all the higher and more important discourses of today Europe, while the national languages, including the strongest among them, German and French, have increasingly retreated onto the level of everyday life and less important discourses. The European cultural languages, as Trabant claims, are today degraded to the domain of home and private life. And he understands this process as a regression into a neo-medieval diglossia. And you know, German language has probably 100 million speakers and is supported by one of the strongest economy in the world, and the cultural power behind it. And Trabant calls German today, in German, das Deutsche ist eine verschwindende kleine Sprache. German is a disappearing little language. And he understands this transformation as a sort of social regression and cultural decline, while the hegemony of English language might create, as he says, communicative paradise. At the end, it would result in what he calls cognitive desert. You might ask yourself what he suggests as the solution. Well, of course, the protectionist nation state. He believes that the German state should put the pressure on all intellectuals to write exclusively German, and that the state organizes on an institutional state level translation of all German texts into English, so that they don't write directly in English. Well, in contrast to Trabant, I understand the process of re-vernacularization of European languages and cultures differently. First of all, I don't understand it as a historical regression and cultural decline, but rather as a transformation of an essentially ambivalent character. It activates a dialectics of gains and losses, and involves plethora of new challenges, dangers, but also chances and opportunities. I said that I call this transformative process the neo-vernacular condition. In contrast to the old vernaculars, the new ones are based on a radically different teleology. The old exist before the order, before they were elevated into the ordered, standardized national languages as we know them, and we can think of them in terms of primal linguistic heterogeneity. Or if you like, a sort of linguistic commons before the national enclosures. The new vernaculars, however, emerge after the order. They are post-standard languages. If a national language is an institution, a neo-vernacularized language is no longer an institution. However, it is a former institution. You know, this is my allusion. You have heard the notion of the former East. You know, during the Cold War, we had the West and the Communist East. The Communist East collapsed, but the West did not collapse, continued somehow to exist. And this is why it needed some sort of the East, now called former East. But what is former East in relation to the proper East? Former East is a sort of afterlife, you know, of Fortleben, as Walter Benjamin would say, which is the notion he uses to describe translation. So when if you would ask me what is mother tongue today, it is sort of post-Yugoslav vernacular, which is a former standard, but is no longer standard. What is important that this neo-vernacular condition applies to entire nation states, their national societies, national publics, national politics, and national democracies. They exist in a sort of interregnum of heterogeneity under the condition of disorder, concretely in the process of transition from the old homogeneity and substantiality of the nation state. I use substantiality really in terms of Carl Schmitt, you know, that a community or a nation state needs some sort of substance. This is transition from the old homogeneity and towards a homogeneity of the new nomos against again, I use the notion of Carl Schmitt, new nomos in terms of Grossräume, in terms of these new large spaces. Such condition implies the ultimate loss of sovereignty and at the same time the traumatic process of a new alignment, subordination under the new nomos. We call it, for instance, in this part of Europe, Euro-Atlantic integration, meaning accession to the institutions of the European Union, NATO, but generally, this is the alignment with the West. This is the major, this is the path towards the new nomos. This alignment process is marked by the constant pressure to develop, to catch up historically and in terms of modern development, to catch up with an instance outside and above. This is either European Union, NATO, the West, etc. This means being constantly exposed to the judgment of a higher instance and measured by the so-called civilizational difference. This is how the civilizational difference, as a legacy of colonial power, has also found its afterlife in the time of new alignment. The neo-vernacular condition also implies an inability of self-governance. The state, it is the state of a never-ending immaturity, constant need for a tutelage, and this also, in terms of using one's own reason. I'm pointing at the collapse of enlightenment, in terms, which means that neo-vernacular condition is characterized by this collapse of the project of enlightenment. And it also implies inability to reproduce oneself without the mediation of a higher instance, linguistically, cognitively, culturally, and politically. You even, within your own language, you even can generate the knowledge of your own history. I analyzed the differences in Wikipedia between English and local articles. And for instance, I found that one very important phenomena of the recent Serbian history has 55,000 characters in English Wikipedia and only 3,000 characters in Serbian Wikipedia, which means 18 times more information in English about your own history than in your own language. This is why I call it also repressive neo-vernacularization. As I said, it carries also many opportunities, and one of them refers to the sphere of education and cultural and social formation. Naoki mentioned yesterday, and Nadezhda also mentioned the problem of the encounter or the foreigners. Naoki said that the encounter with the foreign, which is intrinsic to translation, is always ambivalent. Well, it is ambivalent already at the early stages of the classical theory of translation in Humboldt, and this is why I use the notion of God Janus, the picture, and the problem of fidelity. The problem of fidelity in translation in Humboldt's theory does not refer to the relation between original and copy. It's not about a faithful copy imitation of the original. It's something completely different. Humboldt differentiates between the foreign and the foreignness, das Fremde and die Fremdheit. Das Fremde, the foreign, is something good, something new, which should be introduced by translation into our own language and culture and spirit. This means that it should be welcomed. This is, welcoming the foreign is the concept, Humboldt's concept of translation. Why? Because the foreign is what helps the spirit of your nation to in building I use the German notion, Bildung, formation, education of the spirit of your nation, which is actually, we would today say, culture of the nation. It is useful, while die Fremdheit, the foreignness, is something that spoils the spirit and should be excluded. So the task of translator is to properly differentiate between the foreign and the foreignness, and the task of translation is Bildung of the spirit and the nation, and faithfulness means the faithfulness to this task. My question is now whether a translation that takes place in the vernacular or neo-vernacular domain, and which is based on the concept of heterolingual address, is also capable of Bildung. The famous example is, and Naoki also uses it, told by Rancière in The Ignorant Schoolmaster. This is the case of Joseph Jacatot. He was in Belgium and he could not speak Flemish, and his students could not speak French. Nevertheless, they managed to generate what we education, Bildung, teaching, learning, etc. The Bildung through and by the foreign simply took place before the knowledge of the foreign language was acquired. Interestingly, Jürgen Trabant sees this problem in a very similar way. He asks the question, welche Sprachigkeit bildet? Which language competence educates? Which means forms, Bildung. It is not, he claims, an elaborated, completed language competency or a language fluency like C2, but already the striving to do it, das Bemühen darum, or in German, sich einlassen auf eine andere Sprache, sich einlassen auf die Sprache des anderen, get involved with the language of the other, engage with another language. This is where the Bildung education already starts. This is very important, and he says it is the important and fundamental gesture, and it is this gesture, Gebärde, which educates and bildet. If we can become faithful to the telos of Bildung within the transitional time space of the neo-vernacular heterogeneity, then we can more realistically imagine another world. And now I come to the final, I need a few more minutes, concept of extinction. We discussed it a few days ago in Komija. It was Green Academy, and it is all about extinction, mostly about extinction of species, of plants, of animals, but also extinction of languages and cultures. Some call it today a linguistic and cultural Armageddon. Now we enter this problem of counting the languages, but hegemonic discourse on the topic of extinction of languages stays within this regime of homolingual address in which languages are counted as apples. So, even CNN comes with a very clear, concrete number of the languages spoken in the world, which is 7,111, and talks about how much of them are, for instance, vulnerable, 592, definitely endangered, 537, etc., etc. So the discourse on the extinction is in this of no use for us. Because it really completely relays on the logic of counting languages and apples. But there is something even more concrete when it comes to the extinction of languages that European Union organized recently a study called Europe's Languages in the Digital Age. And a group of more than 200 of Europe's leading language technology experts tested the level of support through language technology for 30 of the approximately 80 European languages. There is no agreement of how many languages are spoken in Europe. The so-called experts estimate that there are between 60 and 200. So we don't know how many. Anyway, The conclusion of the researcher is, and I quote, digital support for 21 of the 30 languages investigated is non-existent or weak at best. When it comes to the future, the picture gets even more grim. The experts foresee that most European languages are unlikely to survive in the digital age. But only if you add to this fact, the fact of digital extinction of national languages and cultures, something much more real and much more sinister, namely the threat of the real extinction of entire nation. I mean, the demographic collapse, you can understand the problem of the finitude of the existing form of social and political life. Take the example of Croatia. We are in Croatia. It has lost in the last 30 years 1 million people. There were less than 4. Now, until the end of the century, there will be less people, but 60% of the so-called Croats will be at the end of century older than 65. Similar is with the Bosnian Herzegovina, even worse, and Serbia, which means that the days of our nations, their cultures and languages are counted. I cannot see realistically how the language that once was my so-called mother tongue, the standardized under the name of a nation or 2 nations, like, Serbo-Croatian or Croato-Serbian, and which I today speak and write only in its neo-vernacular form, I don't see how it can be saved from extinction. And I'm not the god Janus, to see into the future, but what I can do is to pray for his help, so to say, to give us a hope. And there is probably a hope. And this hope is something I would call revolution. The first step into the change, radical change, is to recognize the neo-vernacular condition in its existential meaning as the being of language towards death, or more precisely, the being of dissolution la langue towards the end. It is the current mode of existence, not only of our languages, but also of our nations, their nation states and cultures. Of course, not all, but a significant number, I would say. I know it sounds Heideggerian, das Sein zum Tode, the being towards death. And it is an open allusion to this concept of ontological difference. But what, however, is at stake here is rather something I would call heterolingual difference, and defined it as the experience of the fundamental heterogeneity as the essence of our linguistic praxis, the experience that articulates itself in our encountering the finitude of the existing regime of homolinguality and the international order it has co-created. In fact, I'm not Heideggerian. The ontological difference I mean here is the one interpreted by my late teacher, Gajo Petrovic, under the name of revolution with the capital R. I'm speaking from Korčula, where there was 50 years ago, this Korčula summer school where they discussed this topic of the revolution. And I understand this revolution as the resistance against the new nomos, against the subordination under the new norm, which has been imposed on us in the ruins of the old one. It is the refusal of realignment with the new normative identity blocks. In Ukraine today, it means something impossible, neither the West nor the Russian world. This is why the way out of this binary deadlock can be imagined only in terms of a revolution. And of course, the concept of revolution is deeply discredited, but let me quote Guattari, Felix Guattari, just to remind you. Yes, this is a few seconds. Revolution, like history, always brings surprises. By nature, they are always unpredictable. That doesn't prevent one from working for revolution as long as one understands working for revolution as working for the unpredictable. Thank you.